Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into another juicy topic for nonprofits.
Always excited to be here.
Today we're tackling something that's absolutely critical, but let's be honest. Might not sound the most thrilling at first glance: ethical donor data management. But don't hit that stop button just yet.
Yeah, this isn't going to be a snooze fest about rules and regulations, I promise.
Absolutely not. This deep dive is all about practical insights, things you can actually implement to build trust with your donors and seriously boost your impact.
Because at the end of the day, isn't that what it's all about?
100%. And speaking of trust, did you know that one major gift officer, bless their heart, completely ignored a donor's preference for email and just showed up at their office?
Oh no, I can already imagine how that went down.
Let's just say, not well. And it perfectly illustrates why getting this whole data ethics thing right is non-negotiable.
It's not just about checking boxes. It's about building genuine, lasting relationships with your donors, and that starts with respecting their data and their preferences.
Right, because if a donor doesn't trust you with their information, are they really going to trust you with their hard-earned money?
Exactly. It's all connected.
Okay, so trust is the foundation. But it's a little worrying that, according to our research, a whopping 38% of nonprofits out there are operating without any kind of cybersecurity policy.
That's a scary thought, especially in this day and age.
No kidding. And that's why understanding the why behind data ethics is so crucial. We're not just talking about avoiding lawsuits and bad press, although that's obviously important too.
Right. It's about so much more than just protecting yourself. It's about understanding the tangible benefits that come with building an ethical data culture.
Tangible benefits. Tell me more.
Well, take the Humane Society, for example. They made a conscious effort to really up their game when it came to data privacy and security. And guess what? They saw a 15% increase in donor trust.
Wow, 15%. Now, those are numbers I like to hear.
And that translated directly into more generous and consistent giving. They basically turned ethical data management into a fundraising superpower.
Okay, so responsible data practices equals more donations. Sign me up. But how do we actually get there? Luckily, you sent over a ton of resources on best practices.
Happy to share. There's some fantastic guidance out there.
There really is. And one resource that really resonated with me was that one that laid out like 10 commandments for ethical donor data management.
Oh, yes. I love that one. Sometimes having a clear, concise framework like that can make all the difference.
Absolutely. And, some of those commandments were pretty standard, things you'd expect to see on a list like that. But a few really made me stop and think.
Oh, I hear you. Some of those really get you thinking about the nuances of data ethics.
Totally. Like the very first one, create a clear data privacy policy. Sounds straightforward enough, right?
Right. Seems like a no-brainer.
But then when you dig a little deeper, you realize it's not just about having a policy, it's about informed consent. Making sure your donors truly understand what they're signing up for, what information you're collecting, and how you're using it.
Yes. And that's where that cautionary tale of the well-meaning but misguided gift officer comes in. It's a perfect example of why simply getting consent isn't enough.
It's about quality consent, not just checking a box.
Exactly. Donors need clear explanations, genuine choices, and easy ways to opt in or out of specific communications. They need to feel in control of their data.
So we're being very intentional about how we get that consent. But what about the information itself? That's where the less is more principle comes in, right?
100%.
I mean, nobody wants to fill out a novel's worth of questions just to make a donation, right?
Right. It's all about finding that sweet spot between gathering the information you need and not overwhelming your donors with endless forms. And there's actually a great case study about this from the Nature Conservancy.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that one.
So they realized they were asking for way too much information on their donation forms. And I mean, who can blame them, right? Sometimes we think more data is always better, but they decided to simplify, to ask for only the absolute essentials.
Makes sense. Get straight to the point.
And you know what? Their response rates went up by a staggering 30%.
Wait, 30%? Just from asking for less information?
Yep. It just goes to show that respecting your donors' time and privacy isn't just the ethical thing to do, it's also a smart fundraising strategy.
It's like you're showing your donors that you value their time, and you're not going to bombard them with unnecessary requests. You're building trust by simplifying things.
Precisely. It sends a powerful message about your organizational values.
Love it. Okay, so we've got informed consent, we've got data minimalism. What else jumped out at you from those 10 commandments?
Well, the one about regular privacy checks really got me thinking. It's so easy to view data security as a one-time thing, Like, okay, we've got our policy, we're good to go. But the reality is, it's an ongoing process.
It's like they say, eternal vigilance is the price of, well, in this case, donor trust. But I get it. You're running a nonprofit. You've got a million things on your plate, events to plan, campaigns to launch. It's easy for those regular checks to slip down the to-do list.
Exactly. And that's why building a culture of data privacy is so important. It's not just about having those policies in place, it's about making sure everyone on your team, from the interns to the executive director, understands the importance of protecting donor data.
It's everybody's responsibility, not just the IT department's problem.
100%. And there's a great example of this from the American Red Cross. They did a complete overhaul of their staff training on data privacy, and it made a huge difference.
Really? I'd love to hear more about that. What did they actually change that made such an impact?
So they went beyond just the technical aspects, like here's how you create a strong password, although that's important too, of course. They really focused on embedding data privacy into the very fabric of the organization.
Okay, so it's more about a mindset shift than just ticking boxes on a checklist.
Exactly. For example, they implemented these mandatory online courses on data security for all staff, not just the tech team, and they had to do them every single month.
Wow, monthly. That's commitment.
It is. But it keeps those concepts top of mind. And they didn't stop there. They also started bringing in cybersecurity experts for quarterly talks just to keep everyone engaged and informed about the latest threats and best practices.
Okay, I can see how that would create a culture of awareness.
Hmm.
But monthly training expert talks, that sounds like a lot, especially for smaller nonprofits with limited budgets and staff. What would you suggest for organizations that might not have those kinds of resources?
You're right, not everyone has those big budgets, but that's where prioritization comes in. Remember those 10 commandments we talked about?
Right, the framework.
Exactly. Start with the ones that are going to make the biggest impact with the resources you do have.
So kind of like a phased approach. Start with the essentials and build from there.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of free resources. There are some fantastic organizations out there like the Association of Fundraising Professionals, AFP for short.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, and the Nonprofit Technology Network, or N10N. They have tons of free webinars, templates, even online forums where you can connect with other nonprofits and learn from their experiences.
That's so helpful. It's easy to feel like you're on your own trying to figure all this stuff out.
You are definitely not alone. There's a whole community out there, and organizations like AFP and NTN are doing amazing work to support nonprofits in this area. And honestly, sometimes even implementing one or two new data security practices, like enabling multi-factor authentication on your key accounts, can make a huge difference.
Okay, hold on. You just used a very techie term there. Multi-factor authentication. For those of us who aren't tech wizards, what exactly is that and why is it so important?
You're right, it's easy to slip into jargon. Basically, multi-factor authentication is like adding an extra layer of security on top of your password.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have a strong password anymore.
Well, a strong password is still essential, but multi-factor authentication takes it a step further. It could be a code sent to your phone, or a fingerprint scan, even facial recognition in some cases. So even if someone manages to get their hands on your password, they still can't get into your account without that second factor.
So it's like having a deadbolt on your front door, much harder to break through.
Exactly. And when you're dealing with sensitive donor data, that extra layer of security can make all the difference.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about prioritizing essential security measures, like this multi-factor authentication. We've talked about leveraging free resources and building that culture of data privacy within our organizations. What else should nonprofits be thinking about as they navigate this complex world of data management? It feels like we've covered so much ground already. We talked about the ethical considerations, those 10 commandments to keep us on the right track, and we dove into some practical first steps even for smaller organizations.
It's all about laying a solid foundation, right?
Exactly. But I imagine some of our listeners might be thinking, okay, this is all great in theory, but how do I actually manage all this data? And how do I do it in a way that's both ethical and efficient? It feels like a whole other challenge.
You're absolutely right. Choosing the right data management system, that's a whole other beast. But it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
You know, it's funny you should say that because I was just thinking, we talked about those 10 commandments for ethical data management. Are there any commandments for choosing the right system? What should nonprofits be looking for?
Ooh, I like that analogy. And the answer is yes. There are definitely some guiding principles to keep in mind.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the first one?
The first one, and this might sound obvious, but it's often overlooked, is know thyself.
Channel your inner Socrates.
Exactly. But in this case, it's about really understanding your organization, your specific needs, your pain points. What are you hoping to achieve with a new data management system?
So before you even start comparing features and pricing, you need to get super clear on the problems you're trying to solve.
That's it. For one organization, their biggest pain point might be streamlining donation processing and improving donor communications. For another, it might be about tracking program outcomes more effectively.
It's like you wouldn't buy a sports car if you need to haul a bunch of equipment, right?
Yeah,
You'd need something more practical, something that actually fits your needs.
perfect analogy. And in the same way that there are different vehicles for different purposes, there are different data management systems out there, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so know thyself. What's commandment number 2? Or should I say guiding principle?
Let's stick with guiding principles. The second one is probably not going to be a surprise. Security. This has to be a top priority.
Absolutely. But how do you actually evaluate security when you're looking at different systems? It feels like such a technical area.
It can feel daunting, but there are some key things to look for. First off, don't just take the software company's word for it. Look for systems that have third-party security certifications.
So they've been vetted by independent experts, essentially.
Exactly. And pay close attention to features like data encryption, access controls, and make sure they do regular security audits.
Data encryption. That's
Yeah,
another one of those terms that might need a little explanation. What does that actually mean in this context?
you're right. It can sound like gibberish. Basically, it's like putting all your sensitive donor information in a lockbox that can only be opened with a specific key.
Hmm.
So even if someone did manage to hack into the system, they wouldn't be able to make sense of the encrypted data.
It's like scrambling the data so it's unreadable without the decryption key.
Exactly. It's an essential layer of protection for any sensitive information, especially when we're talking about donor data.
Okay, so we've got security covered. What's the third guiding principle?
The third one is all about thinking long term. It's about scalability. Your organization is constantly evolving, right? You're growing, you're expanding your programs, you're hopefully getting more donations.
Fingers crossed.
Right. Your data management system needs to be able to grow and adapt right alongside you. You don't want to outgrow your system too quickly and have to start all over again.
That makes sense. So how do you evaluate scalability when you're comparing different systems? What are the telltale signs that a system can actually handle growth?
That's a great question. One thing to look at is how easily you can add new users as your team grows. Another thing to consider is how well the system integrates with other tools you're already using, like your email marketing platform or accounting software.
So it's about seamless integration, avoiding those data silos that can cause so many headaches.
Exactly, because the last thing you want is to be stuck manually transferring data between different systems. That's a recipe for errors and frustration.
Okay, so to recap, our 3 guiding principles for choosing a data management system are know thyself, prioritize security, and ensure scalability. Those are super helpful, but I have to imagine even with those principles in mind, it can still feel overwhelming to even know where to start.
Oh, I totally agree. There are a ton of options out there, and it can feel like a jungle. But that's where resources like NTN, which we mentioned earlier, can be lifesavers.
Right, they've got information on pretty much everything.
They really do. They have tons of resources on different data management systems, including independent reviews and comparisons, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
That's such a good point. Learn from others who have been there, done that.
Oh,
Awesome. Well, I feel like we've given our listeners a lot to think about today, both in terms of the why and the how of ethical donor data management.
it's been such a great conversation. And honestly, I think the most important takeaway is that this isn't just a one-time project, it's an ongoing journey. The landscape is constantly changing, so we have to be ready to adapt and learn as we go.
So true. It's about continuous improvement, always striving to do better by our donors and the communities we serve. And with that in mind, we want to hear from you. What were your biggest takeaways from today's deep dive? What questions are still bouncing around in your head? Head over to our website or find us on social media. We're always here to continue the conversation. Thanks for joining us, everyone.